Special edition to Basis 30 Session 2 is Cathi Morgan's lecture presentation at Beauty in 2016. Here, Cathi joins many of the dots, quite literally, organisations, names and places, the key elements of how MK Ultra, the takeover and hybridisation of humanity, is in progress. Here she focuses on MK Ultra and major institutions in the United Kingdom. This is a full-scale takeover and hybridization of humanity in progress. Wake up, humanity, before you become cyborg. Basis 2016 with Cathi Morgan.
Okay, Cathi Morgan is one of the most important researchers in this field. The scale of her experience, the scale of her research is bringing us to a paper trail right into government, right into the actual mechanics of instruments of power in Whitehall and in the aristocracy and in the powers that be. So we're coming to a stage where the actual evidence, the actual stuff of how the instruments of these creatures or these predators are carrying out their actions against us. Cathi Morgan, welcome to Basis 2016. You know it all anyway, you don't need a script.
Thank you, Myers. Hi.
And speak very close to the mic.
Okay, it's slightly different than I had envisaged because I haven't been able to bring my notes up. So that's probably a good thing because it's really boring when someone just reads notes, isn't it? So, I came to this research just a sort of brief introduction. Started looking at my own life because I felt something happened to me, and some of the things that triggered my research were, particularly being part of a national child development survey as a child, which I never thought anything of. It was completely normal, nothing to even comment on. It was just part of my life from the word go. And when I came to start digging into my past, just because of a very strong feeling that things weren't as they ought to be, my parents said we were visited at least every 3 months from birth as part of this survey. And when I went to look at the survey documentation, that was not in the survey documentation. What the documentation said was that the participants would be given a questionnaire, the parents would be questioned at birth, and the first follow-up was at the age of 6. So I've been looking a lot more closely now into this survey. Whilst doing this research, right, sorry, fine. Okay, so when trying to get a picture, I found by talking to my parents and their generation and older, that these people were living in such a climate of fear through the war and through the actual eugenics society that was so prominent in their lives. So in my grandmother's time, people were actually terrified of being thought to be subnormal or defective or deficient, because this is the sort of terms that were being bandied about. Eugenics was mainstream and it was very much accepted, and the view was that, in pre-World War II, was that we need to cleanse the human race of bad stock, and this was mega, and people didn't have obviously the information sources that we have these days, so they trusted the sources of news, and that's the thing really that really gets me when I think that it's all been done because people trusted authority and trusted what was said, trusted the medical community, and that's where we went wrong. So my grandmother had to, she was actually told to smack my mum every time she used her left hand, because my mum was left-handed. My mum was born in 1931. This was the climate that they were living under. Fear and secrecy with a capital S. The eugenics society was virtually the whole of people with influence belonged to the eugenics society, and the consensus was, as can be seen when you look into the documents, that they were superior to the rest of the human race. They literally viewed the masses as a different species, a subhuman species. They had, in the Industrial Revolution, people had been dispossessed of their lands and ended up crowded into cities, and they were very poor. And this was pointed out as a sign of being of poor stock, of having poor genes, because they were just because they were poor. And they decided that the best way to clean the human race was to, if people were so poor that they didn't have any source of income, to put them in the workhouses, which were designed to end their lives very quickly. They were built in the most unhealthy places, and they were worked incredibly hard and given very little food. And they actually discussed welfare and how that would be a bad thing for the human race to encourage these subspecies to carry on living, and certainly they wanted them not to be having children. So eugenics had two sides. It had the negative side where some people wanted to just literally sterilize the poor. Well, I say the poor, people with mental issues, people with disabilities. And the other side of it was to encourage what they considered to be the right kind of people to have lots and lots of children. So that was another aspect of the German Nazi camps, which were only extending the eugenic thinking and the eugenic experimentation that was being done in America and England. And they also encouraged the Frauleins to get together and have babies, whether or not they were married. Motherhood was enshrined, but this enshrining of motherhood the downside was they also wanted to kill the people that they didn't consider to be adequate. So, it's not going to get. Sorry about this. Yeah, so you can just imagine the fear that people were under. Even then, I mean, some of us might remember the fear when we were children and we were being, had lots of information about the nuclear war and the nuclear bomb and the atom bomb and the hydrogen bomb being publicized and put in our faces, and the duck and cover, and how frightened some of us may have realized that we were getting exposed to that sort of propaganda as children. And then you consider, the poisonous gases and the talk about biological warfare, just how traumatized and frightened people were. And all this was clearly done as a method of getting more and more control of the population. Yeah, and the other aspect was these dreadful dreadful so-called treatments that were being done in the mental hospitals. So people also knew that if you displayed the wrong kind of behavior, you might be mislabeled as insane, and that they would be cutting out bits of, bits that you would rather have. But what's clear is when they were doing these new medical procedures, is they didn't really know what was going to happen. So they just tried it to see, almost like throwing mud at the wall and seeing what sticks. It was very unscientific, really. And again, they had to have that eugenic viewpoint of their patients in order to carry this out. So what we're seeing is such a huge divide amongst the people that are successful and go into professions, and who somehow this attitude permeates into their minds, and they tot along behind the consultant and hang on every word and adopt the eugenic attitudes simply to have a career. And again, it's the trust that is being totally exploited. So this is how the situation came about. Now, okay. So briefly, how I came to link research into MK Ultra from my own situation was that my grandmother had mentioned the name Lady Moran. Well, my mother told me my grandmother often mentioned a Lady Moran, so I looked into that and found that she was working at Porton Down with alongside a chap called Joseph Barcroft, who had been her tutor. And when I looked into him, well, first of all, when I looked into her, I came across MK Ultra because her husband, Lord Moran, had been a colleague of Donald Ewan Cameron, and he had gone with Cameron to Nuremberg when they were assessing and treating Rudolf Hess when he was appearing at his trial. And so when I looked into Cameron, I found out he's the one doctor that was absolutely proven to have done MK Ultra type experiments on unwitting patients, and he was paid by the CIA for those experiments, and this was admitted, and they did receive a small amount of compensation, but more importantly, it was out there in the public. Yes, these psychiatrists had been funded for black ops, and were not treating the patients, they were literally experimenting on them. So when I looked at what he was connected to, I found it extremely interesting. I don't know how clear that is, but he was associated with the West London Hospital in London, which was called the Hammersmith Hospital and then became the West London Hospital. There was a neonatal society that was based around the hospital, so he would visit that hospital and work there quite prominently, which was very strange to me because I had gone to that hospital myself to have my first child, and I don't know how that happened. It's just too freaky a coincidence, because my consultant, who was an author called Dr. Hugh Jolly, had been a student with Barcroft, and he'd been a colleague of Barcroft. He was the next generation, but he was majorly associated with Barcroft. Barcroft was also very much linked to the Nuffield Foundation, and it had been the Nuffield Foundation that had sponsored, that were one of the sponsors of the survey I was part of. What else? Yes, and it becomes clear that he was associated with a lot of people. I call them the usual suspects now because they're turning up over and over, a certain group of names, which I'll come to shortly, who were associated with eugenics at that time and with the surveys. So it all started to link together. Now, another thing that I've discovered was that some of you will know who've seen my videos. I found out when I was on Ancestry.com doing my family tree, somebody got in touch and said she was the daughter of my mum's cousin, a cousin that my mum had never mentioned. And his mother had been taken away from the family in Leeds, taken down south, I think to Ramsgate, and brought up and given a better education than she would have got at home because she was a member of a large family. One of the people that took her was her aunt, and there was another woman involved who have not been able to track down. However, so she was Kathleen Zender, like my mother, and she'd got a degree. So she was born about 1906, and she'd left home at 4, and then when she was a young woman, she'd gone and got she was one of the first women to get a degree in the 30s. But her son was a brilliant mathematician. He went straight into the RAE when he got his PhD from Cambridge, which he did at the age of 17. And I've since found, by tracking down a paper that I found by him, which was called Mercury Programs for Lifting Surface Theory. So it's around aerodynamics, and it was for the Black Knight rocket and the Blue Streak rocket, which was the UK space program. So he's literally involved in the UK space program. So this was when I started to suspect that maybe they were trying to create engineers, create mathematicians, somehow, certainly through education, but the question was, were they doing it in other ways too? Now, when I went to Hammersmith Hospital, it was because I was very much a New Age type thinking person, and I was keen to have, I was expecting my baby, he was born in 1978, I was keen to have a very natural, non-violent birth, and the Hammersmith Hospital were purported to do these natural births, and Dr. Hugh Jolly also encouraged the babies to be brought into beds with the mums. He encouraged them to breastfeed, and everyone on the ward had the opportunity to buy the baby slings, which was the very first time they'd come out in the UK. He actually brought them onto the ward and sold them to us. So, of course, I was attracted to that hospital. However, when I turned up at the hospital and the people that were doing those kind of things weren't there, it was, I kind of had to fight to get not to have any drugs and to have the lights turned down low. It just seemed that I was being a bit of a nuisance. And after he was born, he was incredibly alert when he was born. He literally, they put him on my tummy and he made his way to the nipple and he was open, his eyes were open, so alert. And they said, oh, we've got to take him away. And they took him into another room. And when they brought him back, he was all wrapped up tight and shut down completely. And I was kind of trying to recapture the moment. So I was sort of sitting cross-legged on the bed and undoing the swaddling around him. And they said, what are you doing? Have you been taking drugs, sitting there like that, cross-legged? I'd been trying to resist drugs through the whole labour. And so that was, I felt like I had been through a traumatic experience, really, when I gave birth to him. It didn't turn out so good, but hey, I tried my best. So this was my son who I had trouble with then from that moment on. He was the sort of child, a 2-year-old will normally stay close to their mum, or they'll wander off a little way and come back again. But he wasn't like that at all. He would just go and he just wouldn't come back. And he was just incredibly difficult through his whole life. He seemed to be attracted to trouble. And when he was around 6 or 7 years old, he was the police knocked on the door and said he'd been taking bottles of milk off doorsteps and selling them to the local shop. And he was very, astute, and he used to do anything to make money. And it was a nightmare. And but the strange thing is, looking back now, is that I came to realize that within a few hundred yards of where we lived was another young boy, the same age as Martin. They would have known each other. And this other boy ended up being the so-called Rochdale Ripper, who'd murdered girls and was put in prison. And he said he doesn't remember doing those murders at all. And it all started after he'd been to hospital, to the psychiatric unit some time before. And it all sounds really rather suspicious, along the lines of a patsy, the sort of Manchurian candidate patsy type situation. And I've really got a feeling that Martin was also earmarked for something along those lines. However, he did develop schizophrenia when he was 18, or so-called schizophrenia. He said, "Mum, I'm being followed by a satellite," and I didn't know anything those days, and I just thought that was a symptom of his illness, and I didn't ever conceive that that might even be true. So now I reassess that situation, and, you know. So who was his dad? Well, his dad happened to be taken to San Francisco he was about 2 years younger than me, so he must have been born around 56. He lived there till he was around 5 years old. That was just at the time they were running experiments for MKUltra in San Francisco. His dad was a self-taught man, but he became Journalist of the Year in San Francisco, and that set him on a path of a very successful career. At the age of 5 or 6, when they came back to Ireland, where he was from, his father became the head of RTE News, which RTE is the equivalent of BBC in the UK. His father was called Brian Inglis, who's on there over at the left. So I looked into Brian Inglis, and I find he was very connected to the Psychical Research Society. And he was close to quite a well-known person called Arthur Koestler. In fact, Inglis, Koestler, and Instone Bloomfield, who's known as Tony Bloomfield, started a foundation in 1980, and it was called the KIB Association, or Foundation it was, and that was for Koestler, Inglis, and Bloomfield. And the point of the foundation was to promote research into psychic phenomenon for the Psychical Research Society. And surprisingly, when I looked into that society, I found that it was incredibly well subscribed to. In the early decades of the 1900s, the caliber of the people that were members of this society included sort of Lord Balfour and politicians and prime ministers. It was quite mainstream, really. It wasn't on the fringes. It was taken very seriously. So a couple of strange things there I picked up. Inglis and Bloomfield, well, Bloomfield was incredibly rich. He was a millionaire, and he financed Uri Geller coming to the UK. Both Bloomfield and Brian Inglis were involved in bringing him over and televising the programme where he was bending the metal. And of course, Uri Geller was accompanied by Andrija Pohoric, who is a known MKUltra doctor. And Pohoric developed the radiotooth implant, and he developed remote hypnosis and suggestions in that, voice to skull technology. He was working on voice to skull technology and very successfully. So that is really quite a close link to MKUltra, which has sort of helped me kind of put that together, because if I view Niall as being involved in MK Ultra, then it all starts to make sense. Sort of some of the craziness about Martin and the relationship with Niall. Niall, he was oblivious to this. He was very bright. He won a scholarship to. He could have gone to either Cambridge or Sydney. He was studying at University College Dublin. He was studying political history, contemporary political history. But he decided he was going to be a street sweeper instead because he wanted to experience life. So that wasn't too good for me because he was bringing some quite unsavory types around to the flat. So by the time I had my second baby and we were living in London, I was just trying to get away from him. And I did manage to leave him when my youngest son was around, he would have been around 5-6 months old. So that would have been 1980. That's when I left him. Another interesting thing, Bloomfield, as well as being a member of this 1001 Club, and that is interesting in itself because that is a club that is known to be as secret and as powerful as the Bilderbergers, but less well known. It has some members that are in part of the Bilderberg group, and it's linked to the World Wildlife Fund and basically shafting the South Africans. That's kind of, what it's about. And it's quite an exclusive, well, there's just 1,000 members and they have to be very, very rich. So, and another thing, he'd been a director of a bank, of a subsidiary of a bank called John A. Day Bank Limited. So I just clocked that name, and then that came up later on in the strangest way. Okay, yeah. So this I found that the Society for Psychical Research was very much linked to a club, a gentleman's club in Pall Mall called the Athenaeum Club. So here they're talking about a group called the Apostles, which probably bears some looking at as well. It's linked to Cambridge and one of these exclusive secret society type groups. But then they go on to mention that the Psychical Research Society was particularly connected with the Athenaeum Club. Because as well as when I ran away to London and I went to the Hammersmith Hospital to have my baby, a couple of years earlier, when I was 15 and I arrived in London, the place that I ended up working was the Athenaeum Club. So, freaky. I don't know why. I mean, I was a runaway working under a false name too, so it was all rather strange. Yeah, so we've talked about Kessler. There he is in 1969. And he was also, he went to one of the Macy conferences, the cybernetic Macy conferences that have been linked to MK Ultra. So in America, people researching MK Ultra have identified the name of some funding fronts whereby the CIA channeled funds into MK Ultra, and the Josiah Macy Foundation was one of these fronts, and they sponsored conferences, and the members of the people that went to those conferences have later been linked to MK Ultra. So Kessler actually went to one, and it was called Control of the Mind. I don't have my notes here, so I can't tell you exactly what day or who else was there, but that's what he did. Now, he also dropped acid with Timothy Leary. And Timothy Leary, now this quote is from a researcher called Jan Irvin. It's from a paper he wrote called Estrogens, What's in a Name? So I found that there. And he said, this is really interesting. From Kessler, this is Timothy Leary speaking, from Kessler I learned about juvenilization, the theory that evolution occurs not in the adult or adultinal form of a species, but in juveniles, larvals, adolescents, pre-adults. The practical conclusion, if you want to bring about mutations in a species, is work with the young. Kessler's teaching about pedomorphosis prepared me to understand the genetic implications of the 1960s youth movement and its rejection of the old culture. So I believe pedomorphosis is a view of yourself as young forever, almost like a Peter Pan syndrome, where you never grow up. And indeed, the children of the 60s could be viewed in that way. Perhaps. Anyway, Leary, they're still imagining that everything he did was all for the good, but we know now, I used to think it was probably for the good too, but we know now how big a hand the CIA had in that movement. And there is another quote that is linking Kessler with Francis Huxley. Oh yeah, there's the control of the mind quote too. Francis Huxley was the son of Julian Huxley, the zoologist, a scientist, and of course nephew of Aldous Huxley. And in his book, Brian Inglis has written an encyclopedia about hallucinogens. He's published quite a lot of books. He was a television presenter, he was a journalist, he was a commentator, and one of his books, a sort of encyclopedia of hallucinogens. Now, actually, Jan Irvin, in that paper I mentioned, has identified that although the Black Projects, the CIA did their best to portray hallucinogens as a spiritual substance that would open people up to religious experiences, he has identified that they are much more associated with susceptibility and susceptibility to suggestion. In other words, it makes people more pliable and easier to manipulate, and that they constructed or they bigged up this spiritual side of it out of proportion, and he's managed to find the paperwork to prove that is the case. And the paper he wrote, they decided to call LSD a hallucinogen, and he writes about how they came to that name, because they used to be called, was it something like psychosis-promoting substances? Thank you. Yes, so he's traced that the CIA deliberately changed that name because it was an agenda and they wanted them to be used widely. Okay, so, oh gosh, now I've only just come across this guy. It was released in 2014 after he died, that he was working at Oxford University. He was doing research into LSD and hypnosis. And the article that I read about him made it very clear that he was not, although he was working on another funding front, who was funding him was called the Human Ecology Fund, who funded anthropological work, and that's who funded him. They try and make it clear that he didn't know that they were funding from the CIA, but actually it seems now that he did. But they also went into great detail to say he was not doing trauma-based mind control. Some people have said that he might have been using these techniques to compartmentalize people's lives and make Mancunian candidates, but that is not the case. So this is an obituary written about him. They'd already addressed and preempted what was going to happen. In other words, when people found out that he was working under MKUltra in Oxford, that everyone would be looking to see if he was creating Mancunian candidates and inflicting this mind control on the public. So they preempted that in the obituary in the article. So whether he was or not remains to be seen. He was linked to Arthur Kessler and Timothy Leary too. I'm not sure how much is on the screen, how much I haven't got in my notes, so I'm just kind of looking now because I did write notes. Yeah, I have got this quote here, that's good. There we have the Psychical Research Society linked with Abrams and with Francis Huxley, and this is in the UK now, and with Kessler. and there, you know, again, the Joshua Macy Foundation. Now, I'll just say that MK Ultra researchers, well, Jan Irvin again, he's very much the sort of researcher who won't really speculate. He'll only go with the paperwork, and he will not accept any information from anyone unless it's absolutely documented, because he doesn't believe in sending misinformation downstream. So he's very careful. And he has identified the Huxleys. He says that Aldous Huxley was the architect, the mastermind behind MK Ultra in America. And he says no matter where he looks when he's looking into MK Ultra, there's always a Huxley pops up. So I've included anything I found about Huxley is linked to this. I've put that in for that reason, because I respect him as a researcher. So, and they certainly do seem to be linked in here with this. Oh yes, Monroe was funding our Steve Abrams. He was linked to the funding. He's called James Monroe, and he was researching astral travel and remote viewing for the CIA, so linked here again. So this is quite exciting to me to find this direct link in the UK. As I said, it did come out in 2014, but I didn't spot it. But thanks to David, he passed the link on to me here. So thanks, David. So I will just flick through that because we've talked about. Right, now to get onto this stuff at the bottom here. So the surveys I was part of linked to the Population Investigation Committee, the Eugenics Society, and the London School of Economics. Now, I'll just say I only have one memory of those doctor's visits, which is very strange because I had a great memory for things that happened in Bath. I was there, went there at 4, left at the age of almost 12. I remember my phone number, Bath 61430. I remember the name, the registration of our car, POH 133, you know. But I do not remember any of these NCDS doctors coming to visit us, and I do not remember going to visit them, except on 2 occasions. I remember the survey that everyone got at the age of 6. I remember going into the headmistress' office, doing the questionnaire. I remember being told to draw a man. He had pinstriped trousers on, I see it clearly. And then I had to do a reading test, and I was really good at that, and I did really well, and went down the list with all these big words. Remember it really well. And I remember leaving a visit to these doctors. And the reason I remember leaving is because I know we'd come out of this room, and I don't remember a thing that happened in that room. But as we were going, I was with my mum and my twin sister, a doctor, tall, blonde, clipboard. He noticed a blue mark on my sister's leg, and he said, that could be a varicose vein. Would you mind just coming back and running up and down the corridor to my twin sister to see if it's a varicose vein? So that we did, and he wrote something down, and then off we went. But it's just so strange that I remember, because we'd come out and we were supposed to be leaving, and then I remember that bit really clearly, but I cannot see it on the other side of that door. But I know where it was, and this is where it was. The building's there on the left-hand side. This is Bath Abbey Square, and that building there to the left, it was on the first floor of that building, on sort of the side near the bath. So it's near the Abbey, and in this corner here was the dentist on the same floor where we'd had been under gas and had some teeth taken out. So we're probably linked. And just for anyone's information who might know any more about it, that's where we went for our assessment on that occasion, the only occasion I remember. Okay, the Population Investigation Committee, founded by Julian Huxley along with Alexander Carr Saunders, and it grew directly out of the Eugenics Society. As I say, yeah, MK Ultra and the Huxleys. So I'm going to look at Julian Huxley now and 4 of his colleagues. So they are Solly Zuckerman, Alan Parks, Henry Dale, and Alex Carr Saunders. Right, Solly Zuckerman. Solly Zuckerman was a major influence on the design of the NCDS surveys. So he made he was a zoologist. He studied dentistry, he studied zoology, and he became an operational research expert. He was one of Churchill's scientific advisors. And he made a movie with Julian Huxley, Monkey into Man. And they clearly said that they were applying the research that they did into primates to the human, to learn more about the human. That is stated. Part of the research, there was massive research into primates, and some of that was around the space program, and the RAF sponsored some of that, as did the American equivalent. So these surveys were implemented by James Douglas, who'd been a former student of Zuckerman and was also a colleague of him, and David Glass, who became the, I think, deputy director of the London School of Economics. Now, Zuckerman and Douglas had done a survey previously in the war, and what they wanted to find out was what caused the most terror amongst the population. So he did this study, and what resulted was fed to his colleague called Frederick Lindemann, who was in charge and made the decision to bomb Dresden. And what Solly Zuckerman discovered was that what caused the most fear and panic, the absolute worst feelings, was when people lost their homes. So he analysed the essays of school children. He got a lot of school children to write essays about the bombing and what they'd felt. And he analysed their essays. And then he put it all together and he went to Lindemann. And Lindemann is known to have been a cold, psychopathic person who decided to bomb working class houses in Dresden because they were close together and they would get more blood per bomb. So it is just horrendous, and this has been tried to be kept under wraps, and it's only really through the internet it's become more widely known that we committed worse atrocities in Germany than they did with us when it came to bombing. And it was very deliberate, and it was Zuckerman, one of his surveys, that informed that plan. I've spelt Lindemann wrong, there should be a D in it. Yeah, so that's what kind of person he was, superior species, dealing with less superior than their minds. And again, Zuckerman did a lot of primate research, and so did Julian Huxley was also doing a lot of primate research too. So Solly Zuckerman involved with eugenic population studies, including wartime studies around panic and terror, which informed the planning of genocide on German civilians, primate studies. He was involved with Julian Huxley, and he demonstrated that he had the power to implement wide-scale unethical plans on the civilian population. So Aldous Huxley and Julian Huxley both worked at London Zoo with a Jewish emigre, I think she was, called Charlotte Wolfe, and they were examining the handprints of primates and comparing them to mental defectives. And as I put there, during a rather famous speech, Aldous Huxley is very amused to tell people a story of how if they give a primate the opportunity to have some sort of orgasmic sexual experience, that he will do it until death and not eat. And this makes me think of how we're being sexualized as a nation now. Are they applying this research that they did with primates to and programming that into us under knowledge that if a primate would take no notice of anything else and just get involved with that, then would the population do the same? Yeah. So Yeah, the Huxleys belong to the intermarrying Huxleys, Darwins, Galtons, Wedgwoods and Berkeley's families, all of who I've encountered in this research, especially the eugenic research. Now, Zuckerman worked with Douglas, and one of the studies was called The Effect of Sex Hormones on the Performance of Learned Response. So we have Douglas there and Zuckerman, 1948, Sex Hormones and Learned Response. Unfortunately, the other guy, D. Hansen, actually died in a climbing accident, so not much more about him. Okay, in 1936, a population investigating committee is formed, and it was formed amongst other people, the prominent people, H.G. Wells, Julian Huxley, Alexander Carr Saunders, David Glass, the same names come up over and over, C.P. Blacker. Okay, so many of these people founded the Journal of Experimental Biology a decade earlier. So we've got Carr Saunders again, Huxley, and we've also got Joseph Barcroft there, and again H.G. Wells. Now H.G. Wells was a tutor to Huxley, the Huxley boys, to Aldous and Julian and J.B.S. Haldane, A.S. Parks, he's a very interesting character, and F.A.E. Crewe, another eugenicist. William Bateson is the father of Gregory Bateson, and we know Gregory Bateson was majorly involved in MK Ultra. So that's the journal. That's one of the copies of the journal. It started in July. Started in 1923. That's the 24 issue. James Douglas was also involved in that. But they emphasise that the three key actors were Huxley, Hogben and Crewe. So there they are. I've mentioned all those. So Zuckerman had also collaborated with this A.S. Parks on the primary research. The primary focus was in reproduction, and he is just so linked to everyone else. International Planned Parenthood and the Galton Foundation. Now the Galton Foundation is the new name for the Eugenics Society because they didn't want to be called that anymore. Eugenics got a bad name in the war because of the concentration camps, so they decided to change the name. But when they decided that, they said, we must now practice crypto-eugenics, because they were deliberately hiding their agenda at that point. So Parks and Zuckerman studied primates. As I said, there's another study. Now, when it was Parks who was instrumental in bringing about the Abortion Act, who advised Davy Steele, his colleague advised Davy Steele, but he was very much involved too. And he was also a pioneer around the field of oh gosh, that's not cool. I'm so sorry. He was a pioneer around the low temperature field, around freezing of sperm and embryos, and he coined the term cryogenics. So the implications there are obvious, I think. The potential to remove embryos, the potential to freeze them, the potential to replant them if you were interested in some sort of breeding program. And you knew about certain drugs, perhaps like the ancient scopolamine, that meant nobody remembered anything. You could even implant them in people, couldn't you? He was a dreadful character. Yeah, he was associated too with Margaret Sanger and the raging eugenicist Mary Stokes. The close-knit circle of eugenicists in the science and reproductive campaigning made abortion an acceptable method of fertility control. And the chap F.A. Crewe, who we've come across on, started the Experimental Journal of Biology, actually was quoted as saying he wanted to abolish the slum womb. Bearing in mind that they created the slums in the first place because they dispossessed everyone of their land, but then that becomes a factor in why they ought to be stopped from breeding. So that brings me to another chap called Henry Dale, because he's very close to Parkes, and Henry Dale worked at the National Institute of Medical Research in Hampstead. He called Parkes to Hampstead. This was government funded, and Parkes became the secretary of the they call it Committee for Sex Hormones, and he was working on gland extract, pituitary extracts, all sorts of stuff along those lines. And again, we get the usual suspects keep coming up, but what is interesting is another person who's coming up is also Lord Herbert Morrison, who I've talked about because Lady Morrison was around my mum when she was born, and he's coming up on these committees too, with these eugenicists. And also another name that comes up quite a lot, I'll just say, is a guy called Sir John Cockcroft, and it turns out that my twin sister married someone that was related to Sir John Cockcroft, so I always kind of notice his name. So it's all coming together. It's funny, isn't it, when you get a feeling about something and you go with it. Yeah, so Project Paperclip, did we have one in England? Well, if we did, well, Henry Dale was kind of running it. So he was bringing in lots and lots of scientists. Now, before the war, he brought in mega amounts of Jewish German scientists who all went into positions where they would be most useful and their skills would be made most use of. And they probably were traumatized. They were running away from the Nazis. They arrived and they had the chance for a career. It was like, you know, come on, we'll take care of you, we'll give you a great wage, you're going to have a fantastic career. And would they think that this stuff was going to be used against the population? Quite possibly not. I would say probably not in most cases. But they were co-opted in, and their research did go towards these things. And then after the war, as it says there, he brought in, it doesn't say there, but he did bring in a couple of, or a few questionable, to say the least, Nazis. One was called Wolfgang Wirth, who it seems was picked up alongside Mengele. Another was called Kurt Lorenz, and another was called Mars Vogt. And all but three of those did not have their associations with the Nazis really fully resolved. And in some cases, like Wirth, he was working on the gas, the poisonous gas, and running concentration camps. So Dale, it was Dale who suggested that the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute be renamed as the Max Planck Institute. But he had had links with the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute because of his research into ergo and hallucinogens and magic mushrooms, and this is very early research. So then we can't get the Maudsley Hospital, because every time anything to do with this research comes up, any medical person, there's always some link to the Maudsley, and all the people in red are definitely MK Ultra, and the people in orange are probably MK Ultra, are certainly connected there, and they're all connected to the Maudsley. So we've got William Gray Walter on there because he was attending the Macy conferences, for example. Kenneth Oswald Milner there is coming up linked to Sargent, because he was on the committees with Sargent, and he's linked to the narcosis treatment, and he is the chap that's just come up in this new thing that's come out, the Aston House case, where children were put into care because their parents couldn't cope, and they were taken to a hospital even though they hadn't done anything wrong, and they were given similar treatment. Now it's looking like, and this is documented as what Sargent was doing, and they were young pre-adolescent girls, and they were being injected with LSD and truth serum, and they were being kept asleep for days, and and the girl that I spoke to remembers a tape recorder in the room, which seems to be pointing towards the reprogramming of the mind. And she said they actually called it brain mapping when they were doing the treatment. But they hadn't done anything wrong, and they certainly didn't have any diagnosis or medical condition. It's just nobody really bothered about where they were. So, and they all tend to be very, very intelligent girls too, the girls that I've met that have been involved in these care home situations. I met a girl, in fact, who lives quite close to me in Ireland, and she said she was in a care home. And I said, where? And it happened to be 6 miles from where I was living in Bath. So I looked into it, and it was run by the same nuns who ran the Magdalene laundries. And she was, they all did their GCSEs at the age of 13. They were sort of locked in this place. They were always running away. But when they ran away, they were put in solitary confinement for over a week with nothing but a nightie, no bedding, no mattress, just a stone slab to sit on, and again they were scrubbing. They were all having to scrub the floor like the prisoners do with a toothbrush, the parquet flooring, and they all seem to talk about being made to do that. But these are girls that haven't done anything wrong, and this is how it's been. The whole system is just so dangerous. She was. Her mum remarried, and her stepfather was sexually abusing her. So when she told her mum what happened, there was uproar, and she was called a liar. And at 9 years old, she was very well endowed. She is very well endowed, very big breasts. So she was attracting the wrong kind of attention at that young age. And she got a young boyfriend. She got a boyfriend much older than herself. She was 9, and he was 17. So when they found out about this, that's when she was put into care. So she couldn't understand why nobody bothered when she mentioned her father. Stepfather was sexually abusing her, but then when the boyfriend was found out, it was a completely different reaction. He actually was put in prison, hung himself. So these are things that have happened that have been created through this absolute psychopathy and lack of empathy that we encounter in these doctors. This Oswald Kenneth Oswald Milner seems very much like a William Sargent character. The story, this is just coming out now. There's more and more. The BBC have done a Radio 4 documentary on it. So it's like they're going to let this one out. They're giving us this one, and they're managing how it's presented. But they're certainly admitting a lot more than they have done up to now. So again, yeah, it was the emigre doctors that set up the Maudsley. So Henry Dale was a close friend of Joseph Barcroft. He was a sailing buddy, along with a chap called A.V. Hill. I haven't looked into too much yet, but he was involved in some secret mission to America to share scientific breakthroughs, so I'm going to have a closer look at that. As I say, Barcroft was linked to all 3 of the Macy conference attendees that we know of, apart from Kessler. And that's the gestation Macy conferences. So nobody's really talked much about these. I only happened to just find that document there, and I looked, and I thought, Josiah Macy. And it turns out that after the cybernetic MK Ultra Macy conferences in 1953, they started another series of Macy conferences about gestation, embryology, intergenerational sciences, and there is Frank Fremont Smith hosting it, as he did host the MK Ultra Cybernetic conferences. Who was attending those? Well, Barcroft's son was attending them, and he was studying embryology like his father. He was also studying LSD, so as I say, strange combination. And then we come to the Family Planning Association in Great Britain. So in 1963, here's your vice chairmen. All these were vice chairmen of the Family Planning Committee. So same names again. So the other chap I'm going to look at here, Alexander Carr-Saunders, and we'll have a quick look at Lord Robert Platt if we get a chance as well, because he's connected too. So, so He was a trustee of Parks of Galton Foundation, which had been the Eugenics Society, and he happened to be the president of the organisation that opened up less than 4 miles from our house in Bath, the Bath Institute of Medical Engineering. And the other link to my family was that one of the other attendees was our neighbour who lived just at the bottom of our road. There were 11 houses on our street. It was called the Oriel Lodge, and it's a home for people with Alzheimer's now. It's a care home, but it was his residence. Sir Edward Brown, MP, Tory MP for Bath. He'd been associated with Staley Bridge prior to that, actually. So there we have the board of the meetings. I think this is the second year they were meeting. They started in '69, so the third year. So we have an Astor there, the Right Honourable John Astor family. We have this J.D. Wallace, I found, was a researcher in creating abortions using electromagnetic frequencies. We have John Trevelyan, the film censor, who's quoted as saying, "We are paid to have dirty minds," and he's credited with bringing in the Permissive Society as the film censor at that time. Nuffield representative, Erasmus Darwin Barlow there, who's of the Darwin family, of course, and he was also a colleague at St. Thomas's who discussed how to induce convulsions, along with William Sargent. He was a colleague of him. And then we have a representative from the Dawney Day Bank. How about that? So if you remember that Instone Bloomfield, the mate of my husband's godfather, who started the foundation with Kessler, was a director of Dawney Day Bank. So why? I was born in Rochdale and I moved 200 miles to Bath. How come? And then I met Niall in Germany, and he's from Ireland. How come this Dawney Day Bank's showing up on the Bath Institute? Well, the Rothschilds bought it that year. Wonder if there's anything to do with that. I don't know. And then we have Sir Barnes Wallis there, who seems a pretty innocuous chap, but his poor old son ended up marrying, it was his son who married Marie Stopes, and she was a total eugenicist. Completely lala. So Platt was, he aided in the abortion campaign. Now, another interesting sponsor of Bath Institute, the Nuffield Foundation, were funding the Bath Institute of Medical Foundation, who also funded my survey, who Barcroft worked for. British Oxygen was funding them. So I check out British Oxygen, and I find that Lindemann did work for British Oxygen. ICI was always also funding them, and Lindemann worked for ICI, and IBM funded them too. A few other strange funders, the Worshipful Company of Grocers, which is apparently above Masonic, the City of London, worshipful companies. And the interesting thing to me about the British Oxygen Company is that my grandmother used to say that my mum was a twin and that the other one was taken away at birth. And so my grandma, my granddad and my mum always used to just dismiss it. And so I just didn't take any notice. That's what I grew up with. My grandma always used to say, "Oh, your mum's a twin," and my mum goes, "Come on, mum," ignore it. So I find that there was three parties that could have been at that birth. There was the midwife, who I know was called Nurse Knowles. There was a priest, and there was potentially British Oxygen delivering cylinders of gas and air, which they were doing then, to home births. Just an interesting link there, perhaps. So last one, Alexander Carr Saunders. We have to bring him in too, because he was, you might have noticed his name has come up with the Journal of Experimental Biology, it's come up with the Family Planning Clinic, and it's come up with the first one as well, which I've kind of forgotten. So it's come up 3 times anyway. So all these, there it is, London School of Economics, he's director. And the amazing thing about this is his son, Nick Carr Saunders, started a group in the probably late 60s, but definitely 70s, called BIT Information. And it was a real hippie centre where people could go and get information about anything alternative. And it was the place I ran away to. When I ran away at 15, I went straight there. And he was running it, and he's Cass Saunders' son. Yeah, and there he is. And he wrote the book Alternative London, so very much part of bringing in the counterculture. None of these guys knew that the CIA had a hidden hand in it. You know, I kind of talk to people who know these people. They've got a lot of respect for Alex Cass Saunders, the people I've talked to who knew him. He wasn't a bad guy, but he was just part of it. So, isn't it strange? And actually, maybe he was a bad guy, because I did find that he naively wandered into being a member of the Process Church of Final Judgment, which has now got a very bad press and exposure. It was somebody it's kind of linked to Satanists, and what's his name was a member, Charles Manson. But that was he must have been in America, Kenneth Unger, and his wife, Josephine Speyer, is big on promoting natural death and the ability to choose, which could be viewed as eugenic as well. If you make things really hard for pensioners, you know, they've always got that option to top themselves. So she was working on that. Another name that's come up, that's led me into something really interesting. Again, down to David. Thanks, David. Strom Olsen, another TI mentioned his doctor, a memory of a doctor's name, so I looked it up, and I found Strom Olsen seemed to be doing he was doing the narco-hypnosis, and it was when I looked at who he was working with that I found something really interesting. A guy called Edgar Meyer. Now, Edgar Meyer was working part-time with Olsen, and the other part-time, he was part of an organisation called the New Education Foundation. And I found out that was pretty much responsible for, it was like the education half of UNESCO, the education department, and it used to hold its meetings in a place called the Ditchley Foundation headquarters. And that is very much linked to the Bilderbergers. So we've got Bilderbergers, Ditchley Foundation, New Education Forum, London School of Economics, out of which Tavistock came. So I thought that was interesting. Fine, I'm going to look into that a bit more, but I just wanted to just tell you about that. So that's what I'm going to be carrying on looking into. Oh, and of course the Fabian Society. God, how could I forget the Webbs and the Fabian Society? I think we've covered that there. Yeah, so this has been phenomenal. So many things are coming now. It's like I had a little thread and I started pulling it, and it's like things are just coming so much faster, and it's very exciting to add little bits to the picture of the research other people have done, and I hope I found some groundbreaking stuff by looking at my own situation. And I just want to say thanks to you lot, because as I've put there, entering these subjects, which are just a minefield, you know, you've got to be applauded, for being interested and supporting this research and this BASIS project. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Cathi, for a fantastic presentation. You're adding the dots, you're putting the meat on the bones. This is really, really important material. This is stuff which is now right within our reality of, it's not something out there, it's something here.
Yeah.
We have plotters who are taking us out. It's up to us to wake up and take action, but only when we have a strategy that's going to work. Thank you, Cathi Morgan.
Thank you, Michael.
Okay, very, very briefly, we're starting at